The men who drew those maps were not superstitious. They were not making things up to fill empty space on parchment. They were sailors, men who had watched the sea take their companions. Without warning, without explanation, without leaving anything behind. When they scratched here be dragons at the edge of the known world, they were doing what experienced men do, passing on information they had paid for in blood. Every seafaring civilization on Earth built its own language for what lived in deep water. The Norse named it the Kraken. The Greeks wrote about Charybdis. Parisian sailors had a dozen terms for what they saw in open water, most of which never reached any official record, because the men who gave those things names rarely came back to file one. What the legends consistently fail to mention is this: the truth, when you eventually find it, tends to be more unsettling than the story that grew around it. Because the sailors who did survive were not inventing creatures from nothing. They were translating genuine encounters into the only vocabulary available for experiences that had no precedent. In 1752, a Danish bishop named Erik Pontoppidan published The Natural History of Norway. His description of the Kraken was specific, a mass so vast that sailors had mistaken it for an island, dropped anchor on it, built fires, cooked their meals, and understood their mistake only when the island began to descend beneath them. Tentacles the size of masts, eyes like millstones, a body large enough that its sinking created a whirlpool capable of pulling ships under. Pontoppidan was not a gullible man. He cross-referenced accounts from multiple fishermen, weighed their credibility, and concluded that something real was being described. Something in the deep water off the Norwegian coast that his existing categories could not accommodate. The fishermen had a practical relationship with whatever it was. When the Kraken surfaced, it drove fish upward in enormous quantities. The fishing was extraordinary. When it descended suddenly, the fishermen read it as a warning and moved. They feared it and depended on it at the same time. For a century after Pontoppidan, the Kraken occupied an uncomfortable middle ground between natural history and legend. Then in 1854, a Danish zoologist named Japetus Steenstrup presented something to the Scientific Society of Copenhagen that had been recovered from a whale's stomach, a beak made of material harder than bone, roughly the size of a man's fist. Steenstrup argued it belonged to a squid of previously undocumented size. He named the hypothetical animal Architeuthis dux, the giant squid. In 1878, two Canadian fishermen off Newfoundland found a carcass washed ashore at Thimble Tickle Bay before cutting it up for dog food, because that is what practical men do with large dead things on a beach. They measured it. Body, 20 feet. Tentacles, 35 feet. Total, 55 feet. Centuries of Norwegian fishermen had been describing something that was genuinely there, but the giant squid doesn't entirely account for what those fishermen were seeing. The largest confirmed specimen runs to around 45 feet. Impressive. Not capable of sinking ships. Not capable of being mistaken for land. The colossal squid, Mesenacuteuthis hamiltoni, was first described from a complete specimen in 2007. It lives between 1,000 and 2,000 meters down. Its eyes are the largest of any animal on Earth, each one roughly the diameter of a dinner plate. Its tentacles are not lined with suckers. They carry rotating hooks. A complete specimen recovered from the Ross Sea weighed over 1,000 pounds. No complete adult has ever been brought to the surface. The animal exists at depths where even sending instruments requires significant engineering, in water so cold and dark that direct observation remains largely theoretical. The deep sea floor covers more of the Earth's surface than all the continents combined. Less than 20% has been mapped with any precision. Less than 5% has been directly observed. The Norwegian fishermen who described the Kraken were describing encounters with the edge of a world that science, 3 centuries later, is only beginning to understand. The essential fact was accurate. Something very large lives down there. The current question is not whether, it is how large. The Flying Dutchman enters the written record in 1790. A sailor's account of a ghost ship sighted off the Cape of Good Hope, sailing without crew, condemned to those waters indefinitely. It appeared in storms. It vanished when you moved toward it. Seeing it meant something bad was coming. By 1800, it was the most widely known maritime ghost story in the Atlantic world. The details varied. The core did not. A crewless ship, a captain condemned for some transgression the sea had never forgiven. The Dutch East India Company ran ships past the Cape continuously from the late 16th century onward. The Cape was the critical choke point on the route to the Spice Islands, and it killed ships with a regularity that no navigational skill could prevent. The Southern Ocean wraps around the bottom of the world below South Africa. The winds there blow without interruption. The waves build across thousands of miles of unobstructed ocean before hitting the Cape with their full accumulated force. Storms arrive with almost no warning. Ships simply ceased to exist in those waters, leaving no record, no explanation, no bodies. There is a well-documented atmospheric phenomenon called fata morgana, a specific type of superior mirage that forms in cold, dense air near the Cape. It elevates and distorts distant objects, making them appear above the waterline. A ship actually below the horizon can appear reflected in the sky as a ghostly, inverted image, sometimes layered, always slightly wrong in a way that the eye registers before the mind does. Sailors rounding the Cape had no meteorological framework for this. What they had was accumulated maritime experience telling them that a ship moving in the wrong way, appearing and disappearing without explanation, was something other than an ordinary vessel. The Fata Morgana reflects real ships that are actually there, over the horizon, unreachable. The Flying Dutchman was always a real ship. You just couldn't get to it. The most documented sighting in the historical record did not come from an anonymous sailor in a port tavern. On July 11th, 1881, the Royal Navy training vessel HMS Bacchante was sailing off the Australian coast when multiple crew members reported seeing the Flying Dutchman. One of them was Prince George, the future King George V, then 16 years old. He described a luminous vessel appearing during the early morning watch, glowing with a red light. 13 men on board saw it. The lookout who first spotted it fell from the rigging and was killed later that day. The bioluminescence of the Southern Ocean is real and documented. Certain conditions cause the surface to produce a glow that can illuminate a vessel from below, making it appear self-luminous. Combined with a Fata Morgana distortion and the weight of a story every sailor already carried with him, the conditions were sufficient to transform an explicable event into something that none of the witnesses had a better word for. The Flying Dutchman is the Cape of Good Hope given a human face. The story of a man who refused to yield to the sea, and whom the sea therefore kept. On August 6, 1848, the crew of HMS Daedalus reported a sea serpent approximately 60 miles southwest of the Cape of Good Hope. Captain Peter McQuay filed an official report with the Admiralty upon reaching Plymouth. The report described a creature at least 60 feet in length, serpentine, with its head held approximately 4 feet above the water. It moved without visible undulation. It passed the ship at a distance of around 200 yards. The encounter lasted roughly 20 minutes. Richard Owen, the most prominent British naturalist of the period, publicly suggested the crew had seen a large seal. This produced a pointed letter from Captain McQuay, who noted that he had spent his entire professional life at sea, that he was thoroughly familiar with large seals, and that what his officers had observed for 20 minutes at 200 yards was not one. Between 1817 and 1819, An extraordinary sequence of sightings occurred in Gloucester Harbor, Massachusetts. Over 2 years, hundreds of people reported a large serpentine creature offshore. The witnesses were not credulous fishermen. They were merchants, lawyers, ship captains, a harbor master. The Linnean Society of New England sent investigators and collected sworn depositions from more than 20 witnesses. The descriptions were consistent enough that the investigators concluded something real had been seen. Most accounts described a creature 60 to 100 feet long, moving in vertical undulations, with a head resembling a horse or large turtle. The candidate science proposes the oarfish, a deep sea species capable of exceeding 50 feet in length, with a ribbon-like form that could, under certain lighting conditions, appear serpentine. Oarfish are known to surface when dying or disoriented, but the Gloucester witnesses consistently described vertical undulations, which is not how an oarfish moves. The giant squid was a myth until 1854. The colossal squid was unknown to science until 1925. The megamouth shark went undiscovered until a specimen was accidentally caught on a naval anchor in 1976. The ocean's catalog is genuinely, provably incomplete. The sea serpent tradition appears in every maritime culture on Earth, across thousands of years of independent record-keeping. The consistency is itself a form of evidence, not proof that a single species exists, but a strong indicator that sailors around the world, repeatedly, over centuries, were encountering something that didn't fit the creatures they already knew. The gap between what the scientists say and what the witnesses with sworn depositions say they saw. That gap is where the legend lives. Every sailor who went to sea before radio and weather satellites understood one thing with absolute clarity. The ocean was the place where men went to disappear. It took people. It did not return them. It offered no explanation. Davy Jones first appears in print in 1726, in a novel by Daniel Defoe, a character using the phrase Davy Jones's locker, as though the reader already knows what it means. The casualness of the reference suggests the phrase was already in common circulation. The origin is contested. One theory connects it to Saint David, patron saint of Wales. Another suggests a corruption of the biblical Jonah, the locker being the whale's belly. A third proposes an actual man, a 16th century tavern keeper who maintained a locked room where he press-ganged sailors into involuntary naval service. What the phrase described was precise: the chest at the bottom of the ocean, where the sea kept everything it took. A name for the final destination of men who died at sea and whose bodies were never recovered, which, during the age of sail, described the majority of men who died at sea. But Davy Jones's locker is not entirely metaphor. The cargo that went down with those ships was not simply lost. The 1715 hurricane destroyed 11 of 12 Spanish treasure vessels in a single night off the Florida coast. Coins from that fleet still wash up on Florida beaches after storms. The silver bars from the Atocha lie scattered across the floor of the Caribbean, exactly where the water put them. The accumulated wealth of centuries sits intact in the dark at the bottom of the ocean, inaccessible and permanent. The terror in the legend is not only the terror of death, it is the terror of disappearance, of a vast underwater darkness that holds everything, surface world lost, and holds it forever. The Bermuda Triangle entered popular consciousness in 1964 when a writer named Vincent Gaddis coined the phrase in an article for Argosy magazine. He described a roughly triangular region of the North Atlantic, Miami, Bermuda, Puerto Rico, where ships and aircraft had disappeared at an anomalous rate. By 1974, Charles Berlitz had published a best-selling book proposing explanations ranging from magnetic anomalies to the lost city of Atlantis to extraterrestrial intervention. It was also, as subsequent investigators found, extensively inaccurate. Lawrence David Couchet spent years going through the actual records behind every loss cited in the Bermuda Triangle literature. His book, published in 1975, was called The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved. Many of the ships and aircraft cited as triangle losses had not disappeared in the triangle at all. Some went down in the Pacific, some in the North Sea. Some had not disappeared at all and were still in service when writers claimed they had vanished mysteriously. The most famous triangle disappearance, Flight 19, 5 Navy Avenger torpedo bombers that went missing on December 5, 1945, appeared in virtually every triangle book as evidence of anomalous forces. The actual record is different. The flight launched into deteriorating weather. Lieutenant Charles Taylor became convinced he was somewhere he wasn't and continued flying northeast when his actual position required him to fly west. The aircraft ran out of fuel over open ocean after dark. A rescue aircraft sent to search for them exploded shortly after takeoff, probably due to a fuel leak. 14 men died. There was no triangle involved. Lloyd's of London does not charge elevated premiums for vessels transiting the triangle. The U.S. Coast Guard has consistently stated that the rate of losses in the region is not statistically different from any other heavily trafficked ocean area of comparable size. And yet the region is genuinely dangerous, not because of anomalous forces, but because of entirely normal ones operating with unusual intensity. The Gulf Stream moves northward through the triangle at speeds of up to 5 miles per hour, dispersing the wreckage of a sunken vessel across hundreds of miles within days. The Western Atlantic produces sudden waterspouts, capable of destroying a small vessel in minutes. Microbursts can generate winds over 100 miles per hour in a radius of less than a mile, creating seas that overwhelm a ship before any distress signal can be sent. The Bermuda Triangle is the only legend here that was largely constructed after the fact, rather than grown from the accumulated experience of sailors. The other 4 were built by men trying to describe something they had actually encountered. The Bermuda Triangle was built by writers selecting data to support a narrative already in place. The losses were real. The pattern used to frame them was not. What the mapmakers who wrote Here Be Dragons understood is that the ocean has always been larger than our understanding of it. The Kraken was a genuine encounter, filtered through the terror of men who had no framework for what they were seeing. The Flying Dutchman was a name given to the despair of watching ships disappear at the Cape year after year with no explanation worth speaking aloud. The Sea Serpent was honest testimony from witnesses who saw something that didn't fit their existing catalog. Davy Jones's locker was the only truthful thing anyone could say about where the dead of the sea actually went. And the Bermuda Triangle was the attempt of a modern world, one that had decided the ocean was conquered, to account for persistent evidence that it was not. The legends were never about monsters. They were about the limits of human knowledge in the face of something that acknowledged no such limits. They were the way that practical men with practical problems gave shape and name to a darkness that had no shape or name. The ocean is still there. The depths are still largely unmapped. The colossal squid still hunts in water too cold and dark for cameras. The wrecks still lie where they fell, untouched. The Gulf Stream still scatters evidence across miles of open water. The Fata Morgana still appears in cold air over the Cape, showing sailors' ships that are real and unreachable. The map said, "Here be dragons." It was not wrong. It was simply describing something that no single word could contain, something that descended 60 feet below the surface of a Norwegian fjord and left behind a school of fish, so dense the fishermen said you could walk on it. Something that glowed red in the early morning watch off the Australian coast and then was gone. Something that passed a Royal Navy vessel at 200 yards for 20 minutes and left 20 credible witnesses who all told the same story. They are still here. We have simply run out of better words for them.